Well, afternoon, everyone. My name is Bobo Katlego Faith, and I will be presenting legalities, sick leave, death certificates. So I'll be starting with a brief introduction and then moving on to sick leave. I'll be discussing basic conditions of the Employment Act, and then we'll get into the real bulk of the presentation, which is the death certificate or the DHA 1663. We'll be discussing the who, the why, the when, the how. Then we will quickly run through just 3 brief case scenarios just to get an understanding of the reporting of death and then a conclusion. So starting off, prior to registration as a medical practitioner in South Africa, newly qualified doctors have to undergo a 2-year period of supervised training internship. So none of this is particularly new to us as we find ourselves nearing the 3-quarter mark of internship. I essentially put the slide here just to remind us of the fact that there is a governing body and a greater set of governing rules. And essentially everything we do, as I'm sure we've come to realize, has a strong legal foundation, and there are specific regulations that aim to guide us and to which it would be most beneficial to adhere to. So this book may or may not be familiar to some of you, but it's the HPCSA Guidelines for Internship Training. So interns at Hill & Joseph received this book on day 1. But it's a helpful guide to be utilized when considering a transfer to other facilities, general rules and regulations that guide the training, and specifics on each rotation and its requirements. It's also a fantastic go-to reference when deciding on taking a leave of absence and or understanding the requirements surrounding sick leave. So bringing us to our first point. So leave, quite honestly, everyone's favorite word after post-call. So essentially annual leave of 22 working days per year. So that's 44 days over a period of 2 years. And as stated on the slide, the provision of leave benefits forms part of the conditions of service of the Department of Health, but it's mostly in accordance with the Labour Relations Act and the Department of Public Service Association. So family responsibility leave is of 10 days a year, so 20 days in the period of 2 years, maximum of 5 days for death of a direct family member or spouse, 10 days paternity leave, 5 days for illness of a direct family member. Maternity leave may be granted for a period of 4 months, resulting in extension of the internship training by an additional 4 months. And then we have special leave. So this is up to 7 days per year, may be approved for core skills training related to internship, maximum of 5 working days in 2-month rotation, 7 days in 3-month rotation, and 12 working days in a 6-month rotation. So essentially, more than 2 months of leave in the 2-year period may result in extension of training in specific domains. But if the competencies have not been achieved and if the period of absence exceeds 20% of the total training time of the domain, it may be extended in this regard. So in a 3-month rotation, no more than 18 days and no more than 12 days in a 2-month rotation. So sick leave is 24 days over the period of 2 years. So obviously you have to apply for sick leave, but that is done directly through HR. And then we just thought it would be interesting just to add COVID leave, as this is the current pandemic we find ourselves in. So the self-isolation period of 10 days, which was previously 14 days, is actually deducted from the above 24 days of leave. So if the period of sick leave has been fully utilized, it is to the employer's discretion whether additional leave is taken from special leave, unpaid leave, or then annual leave. We are contractual workers, so we're not permanent workers. So most of the basic conditions of the Employment Act form, or rather are applicable to permanent employees. But proof of incapacity, or for someone to apply for proof of incapacity, you have to produce a medical certificate. And obviously the person signing this off has to be registered by the professional council, in our case, the Health Professionals Council. So the Act does not require a diagnosis, only that the employee was unable to work for the duration of the employee's absence. Occupational injuries and diseases are not included, and they're handled separately. And any disclosure of illness therefore rests with the employee. So workplaces, it's suggested, should have an occupational health practitioner, which most of our facilities do, who should inquire the patient employee's medical practitioner and ask the nature and extent of the illness. However, any disclosure of illness, I just want to reiterate this fact, rests with the employee. And essentially, if your employer finds out details surrounding your medical condition, they will be bound by the duty to confidentiality. Now moving on to the Birth and Death Registration Act. So in South Africa, civil registration, of which the death registration is part, is the responsibility of the Department of Home Affairs. So the above mentioned act requires that all deaths be certified by a medical practitioner on the death certificate form, or the DHA 1663. So in some situations, it's possible for a person designated by the Department of Home Affairs, for example, a registered professional nurse who can certify stillbirths, thereafter any medical practitioner. So it is the responsibility of the health professional to complete the required sections of the form and to ensure that confidentiality is maintained. Thereafter, the other sections of the form are completed by the informant, funeral undertaker, and the Department of Home Affairs officials. So essentially, it is the responsibility of the next of kin, or the informant, or the funeral undertaker, to ensure that the death is registered with the Department of Home Affairs. Home Affairs cannot issue the notification of death, or rather the burial order, unless they have received the forms from the parties I've just mentioned. So if we move on to just a few definitions, according to the ICD-10, the immediate cause of death, that's the final disease, injury, or complication directly causing the death. Should be noted that the mechanism of death or terminal event, for example, your heart failure, cardiac arrest, respiratory arrest, is not considered to be a valid underlying cause of death and should not be reported on the death certificate without stating the preceding disease or injury. The underlying cause of death is the disease or injury that started the sequence of events leading directly to death, or the circumstances of the accident or violence that produced the fatal injury. Contributing causes are the significant conditions contributing to the death, but not part of the direct causal sequence. So, who? The question often arises as to whether an intern should complete the form, or should it be your MO or your registrar. So according to the Birth and Death Registration Act, a medical practitioner completes the DHA 1663. And this is in terms of the Health Professionals Act. A medical practitioner, as I mentioned, is a person registered as such by the statutory body, the HPCSA. An intern is not technically a registered medical practitioner, as we're still receiving training. However, Section 32 of the Health Professionals Act allows an intern to perform any function or issue a certificate or other document in which in terms of a law is required to be performed by a medical practitioner. Therefore, legally speaking, interns are allowed, and legally speaking, we can fill out the death certificate. As you see on the slide, it's actually a quote from the guidelines and the book I showed you in the second slide. It is safer and kinder to the intern that a more senior person does so, meaning filling out the form, as it places undue medical legal responsibility on the intern, which can be avoided in a big hospital. However, it is still important that we know how to fill out the form, as legally speaking, we can. So why? Why do we need to fill out the form? This is a permanent record of the fact of death, providing pertinent information on the demographics of the deceased, provides statistics on causes of death, assisting governments to budget accordingly and identify needs and allocate resources. It is helpful in tracking infant and maternal death, and actuaries use it for pension and life insurance calculations. So when do we fill out this form? So if a natural cause of death is suspected, the death certificate can be completed by a medical professional, as I stated, interns, this is us. If unnatural cause of death is suspected, the forensic pathologist fills out the death certificate. So you can refer to forensic pathology in the event of a death due to physical, chemical influence, direct or indirect, your gunshots, MVA falls, exposure to lightning and poisoning, an act of commission or omission, omission being failure to act, so a death resulting from neglect, commission being an act against the law, for example, a homicide. Procedure-related deaths, diagnostic, therapeutic, or palliative procedure-related death, a sudden, unexpected, or unexplained death, especially in a healthy individual. This is essentially just the flow. As I previously discussed, the certifying doctor will examine the body, verify the death and the identity of the deceased. It's very important that you make sure that you are certifying the correct individual. We complete section A, B, C, or it's rather A, B, or C, and G of the form. We then give the form to the informant, who completes section D. The undertaker will then complete their respective section, which will then go to Home Affairs, and they'll be able to issue out the burial order, and then Stats SA can use this information thereafter. So how? General instructions essentially are that each item on this form, the DHA 1663, should be completed using black ink and block letters. The use of abbreviation should be avoided. The spelling of names should be verified against the most recent identity document or passport if available, otherwise with the informant, who is typically a family member. If you make any alterations or errors on the form, try your best to avoid these, but if unavoidable, just initial next to your error and sign it off, and make sure you're covered in that regard. The rest of the form is pretty much self-explanatory. Just go step by step and fill out the relevant details with regards to the actual person you're certifying. So moving on to the next section, this is to be completed by the same medical practitioner or the professional nurse who completed section A. So medical practitioner must certify whether he or she is responsible, or is in a position rather to certify, and that the deceased died solely due to natural causes. So this would only be for a natural cause of death. So as I mentioned earlier, it's important that the medical practitioner conducts an external examination of the unclothed body in order to exclude any visible injuries that may suggest that the death is due to unnatural causes. So you'll be looking for your stab wound, your gunshot wound, especially in cases where the cause of death is not known. So if the medical practitioner is not in a position to certify that the deceased died exclusively due to natural causes, then the medical practitioner should contact a police officer who will open a docket and ensure transportation of the body to forensic pathology services for a post-mortem examination or an autopsy. The forensic pathology services can also be contacted directly to make these arrangements, and after their forensic investigation, the death certificate will be completed by the forensic pathologist or the medical practitioner who conducted the medico-legal post-mortem. It's interesting to note, in the case of an unnatural death, say a gunshot chest in the ED, a Form D28 is completed, and this serves as a referral to the forensic service.
All right, so for section C, this needs to be filled out by the medical practitioner, forensic pathologist who's conducting the medical legal investigation. So this section is filled out if the cause of death cannot be declared to be due to natural causes with absolute certainty, and the body needs to undergo medical legal investigation. So number 30 requires the individual to indicate whether the death, after undergoing this medical legal investigation, was then declared natural, unnatural, or if it's still under investigation. And number 31 to 39 is pretty self-explanatory and is usually filled out by the forensic pathologist, giving information about the individual and the facility that conducted the investigation. Section G, so this is the important part, which is filled out again by the medical practitioner or professional nurse or forensic pathologist who determined the cause of death. Number 69 to 76 basically includes demographic information about the deceased, the place of death, and the information of the facility at which the patient died or was certified dead. Section G.1, again, filled out by the medical practitioner, professional nurse, or forensic pathologist, and it's for all deaths that occurred after 1 week of life. So part 1, the immediate cause of death, which is reported on line A. So this is the final disease, injury, or complication directly causing the death. It can be the sole entry in this section as the cause of death if that's the only condition that caused the death. So lines B, C, and D. On line B, we report the disease, injury, or complication that gave rise to the immediate cause of death, which was indicated on line A. And if the condition you've indicated on line B was the result of another condition, then this condition should be indicated on line C. Essentially, it should all be indicated sequentially, with one condition per line, with the most recent condition at the top or on line A. If you need more than 4 lines, you can add additional lines and write due to next to each condition that you add. Part 2, the section, in this section, all other important diseases or conditions that were present at the time of death and may have contributed but did not lead to the underlying cause of death can be reported. All this will be made a bit clearer as when we go through the case studies. Number 78 and 79. 78 is used to indicate the patient, if a patient was pregnant or not for female patients. And this is very important as it's used for maternal death records and statistics. Number 79 is basically a tick box, and it's used to indicate the method used to determine the cause of death. Section G.2, this section is for all stillbirths or deaths that occurred for individuals that are less than 1 week old. So the definition of a stillbirth, according to the Births and Deaths Registration Act, number 51 of 1992, a stillbirth means that the fetus had at least 26 weeks of intrauterine existence or 28 weeks since last menstrual period, but showed no signs of life after complete birth. Any infant that shows signs of life after birth is regarded as a live born. These signs include breathing, beating of the heart, pulsation of the umbilical cord, and or definite movement of voluntary muscles. So number 80 to 88 is maternal information. Again, pretty self-explanatory, but includes antenatal information of pregnancy. Number 89 to 94 is information surrounding the birth of the neonate, and this is also where you indicate whether it was a stillbirth or not. And number 95, as you can see here, is the cause of death of the neonate. So on line A, here we enter the single most important condition that made the greatest contribution to the death of the infant or the fetus. Line B is any other disease or condition of the infant or fetus. And then line C, we enter the most important maternal disease that had an adverse event on an adverse effect rather, on the infant or fetus. And line D is any other maternal diseases or conditions that had adverse effects on the infant. And line E, lastly, reports any other circumstances that had a bearing on the death, but cannot be described as a disease or condition. For example, someone perhaps giving birth at home and not being in the presence of an attendant or someone to help them. So Katlego will now go through quick few case scenarios just to make it easier to understand.
Okay, so we'll be going through a few examples of filling in the death notification. We will only be focusing mainly on section G and number 95 of the perinatal death section, as it is the most important statistically wise and also the most challenging part of the form to fill in, and also has many incorrect filling problems. So our first case is a 67-year-old male, Mr. James, who is known with type 2 diabetes, hypercholesterolemia, and
Sorry, Bobo, can I suggest that we discuss these cases next week?
Okay, sure, Prof.
Because I think let's go to the presentations, and if you can just send this to me in a Word document, it'll be easier.
Okay,